Also, Alex, one more thing.
Yeah.
If it's not a bother, you may have to hold the mic a little closer while you speak, because we'll have a set of students joining us in person for the live stream, and we don't have a very powerful speaker system.
Okay, so I think that I'm as close as possible, but we
Okay.
can do one thing. Let me just check the PowerPoint. If you want me to use headphones, you can tell me whether that is better or just speaking like this is better. Let me know.
Okay.
But just give.
Okay. I'll get back to you about that in just a minute.
Yeah, it's not allowing me to do that as well. Okay, let me just log back in. At least it's not allowing me to do this here for some reason. I'll just log
Okay.
back in. Yeah.
Also, Alex, you will not require earphones. I think you're audible in the other classroom.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Yeah, I'll just log back in. Amit, can you just tell me if you're able to see the title slide?
Yes, I'm able to see the slide. Politics, philosophy, microeconomics, Alex and
Okay.
Thomas.
All right. All right. All right. Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to check that. Uh,
Alex, just one more thing. Uh, so we were thinking that we could reserve 30 minutes after your talk for questions. But
Sure.
uh, in case we do get a lot more questions than expected, and if and depending on whether you can or would like to take them, we can also extend the duration.
Sure. Sure.
So on our end, we don't have a time limit per se.
Okay.
While it's already 6 o'clock, I think we're seeing quite a few people join in just now. So if you can wait another few minutes, will that be all right?
Amit, also just one thing, in case power goes, my internet will get disconnected, but I'll be back in like, maybe 10, 20 seconds.
Okay, no problem. Okay, I think we can begin now. So, firstly, I'd like to thank our speaker for the evening, Dr. Alexan Thomas, and all members of the audience for taking time out to be with us at the end of what may have been a busy week for many of you. This is the Development Study Group's first public lecture of the current academic year, and I take personal delight in hosting Alex, who was my teacher until a few months back. By way of introduction, Dr. Alexan Thomas teaches at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. His primary interests lie in the domain of history of economic thought, with a focus on classical political economy, and has published in both national and international journals. He is the author of the textbook Macroeconomics and Introduction, which is celebrated for the refreshing and novel approach it brings to economics education. He has been on the council of the European Society of the History of Economic Thought since 2022 and is a founding member of the Indian Society for the History of Economic Thought. The topic of Dr. Alex Thomas's lecture today is philosophy, politics, and microeconomics. Amidst mainstreaming of the subject and rising attacks on pluralism, we hope that this lecture will push us to both view dominant theories and methods in economics critically and appreciate the necessity of pluralism for a well-rounded economics education and practice. The lecture will go on for 45 minutes, and after that, we will take questions. So, without further ado, Alex.
Thank you, Amit. Let me just share my screen. Amit, can you just tell me if the screen is visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So, thank you so much, Amit and Varanya, on behalf of the Development Study Group at South Asian University for inviting me. Certainly, I must add that I think that I was trying my best not to take up further commitments, but because former students invited me, I found it difficult to say no. But I'm happy that I'm here. I also wanted to just mention that in the last several years, I've had many occasions, especially workshops and such events, to converse with students from South Asian University. And maybe I could mention some of their names here only because this is organized by students. And I think that I just want to acknowledge that I've had many discussions with Fizza, Tathagat, Jacob, many of the pluralist events that we have organized. And I also want to mention that this talk, in a slightly different form, but very similar, was actually given at South Asian University in 2022 in person. And at that time, I also enjoyed the warm hospitality of Professor Sneha Ashish. And in case there are people who have listened to my talk in 2022, I hope that thanks to AI and social media, you would have forgotten almost everything that I've spoken about. So, with that broad kind of preface, let me begin the presentation. And maybe just a comment on the title. I think that actually the reason for putting the title is partly because I thought it would be a variant of PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics, which might be familiar to some of you. And this is how economics was formally taught, at least in Oxford University, from the 1920s. And if you take a look at its preamble, what it says is that to promote the study of the structure and the philosophical, political, and economic principles of modern society. So, what I'm going to do today is to ask certain questions which are philosophical in nature to microeconomics, and also talk about some of the implications to politics from microeconomics. So that's the way in which I've sort of structured this presentation. And by way of origins, I just want to mention that this is, the interest in this kind of a topic has been there for a very long time, from about 2011, when I had written a blog post which I titled The Politics of Microeconomics. And the reason for this is that generally, when we think of macroeconomics, people associate macroeconomics more with policy making and politics. But when we think of microeconomics, it is less associated with politics. And I just wanted to make that more visible. And also in 2011, it was the other important event within economics was that many students had walked out of Mancu's class, who teaches basic economics at Harvard University. And subsequently, I've had various kinds of engagements with this topic. And also, I just wanted to mention that what I'm going to do in this lecture is primarily going to pose certain questions to make you think. And it is not my intention to give you, ready-made answers to many of the questions relating to microeconomics, but it's really to question mainstream microeconomics. Right. Having said that, when you take a look at microeconomics, what we might have studied, and it's very likely that many of us would have studied these books on microeconomics by Mankiw, Varian, Ahuja, Mascolel, etc. And the question that I want to ask is it many microeconomics or is it just one? I mean, we have all these different kinds of textbooks. But the fact of the matter, and as I think that as almost all of you know, it is that what we are taught is just one kind of microeconomics. And I want to call it marginalist microeconomics. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more subsequently. Right. And here I would also like to mention that very often what we are taught in the form of Keynesian macroeconomics is also a marginalist interpretation of Keynesian economics. Now, to people for whom the term marginalist might not be familiar, you can think of it as neoclassical microeconomics or neoclassical economics. But the reason I do not want to use neoclassical for this presentation and in general is that neoclassical seems to suggest that there is some continuity between classical economics and marginalist economics, or whatever came after classical economics. But in fact, what you see and what I'm going to also bring up in today's presentation is that there is a fundamental difference between classical economics and marginalist economics. So I'm going to refer to it as marginalist economics. But if you find it more convenient, you can think of it as neoclassical economics. And what the way I'm going to go about it, and I'm happy to take questions at the end, which is why, the presentation is more open-ended that way, and I'm happy to take more questions at the end, is I'm going to go through 13 points, which I think are quite basic and elementary, but very often we skip through them very quickly in our regular classes. And many of these ideas can also be found in Krishna Bharadwaj's work, Classical Political Economy and Rise to Dominance of Supply and Demand Theories. And it is very clear in Krishna Bharadwaj's work that there is a distinction between classical political economy or classical economics and supply and demand theories or marginalist economics. In particular, I'm interested in some of the political underpinnings, right? As the title of the presentation goes, as I've already mentioned earlier, one is the political underpinnings, but also the political implications. And when I'm talking about implications, I'm thinking broadly. When I'm thinking about politics, also I'm thinking much more broadly than just policy making, right? But also it includes which party or which group are we going to vote for, but it also includes in what ways the economics curriculum formulated and what kind of pedagogy happens in the classroom, right? And apart from all this, also different kind of collective politics as well, right? Based on this kind of microeconomics, what are the implications for a variety of political uh, needs? And so let me begin by definition. And I think I always try to do this to start from first principles, because I think that that's where some of the key philosophical implications or key philosophical assumptions come in. And then we sort of forget them. So if you begin with the definition of microeconomics, the way it is defined, it is seen as a signs of scarcity. And this mainly owes to Lionel Robbins, right? Especially in his essay on the nature and significance of economic science. Very often, when I ask in my class, what is microeconomics? The answer that I now get is that it's a science of choice. Again, this comes from a certain kind of constrained optimization. And here, actually, there's another important point to note. It is because economics is defined as a science of constrained optimization that we all have to study calculus and optimization of the kind that we study. Just like there are different paradigms and different approaches in economics, there exist different approaches in mathematics, but we choose to study certain kinds of mathematics because it is defined by how we define economics itself. And here, the question that is of important to ask is that because marginalist economics defines itself as built on scarce resources, if one looks around and asks the question, is labor scarce, right? And the answer is no. So how do we have a theory which postulates full employment to actually explain a certain kind of unemployment of labor or underemployment of labor in the context of the global south, or more particularly in the Indian context? Right? And now, if you have this kind of a definition of economics, which is about scarcity or constrained optimization, it has an influence on everything else that happens within economics, including the curriculum, right? Including the kind of problems that are posed, including the kind of arguments that are being made. The second aspect I want to talk about is labor and capital and how it is conceptualized. The way it is conceptualized in microeconomics is to think in terms of factors of production. Again, this is something that is taught. If some of us have studied economics in school, it's also taught to us in school, right? So that you have land, labor, and capital, which is considered factors of production. One thing that immediately might strike anyone who has read, let's say, Marx, or for that matter, Ricardo, or for that matter, Adam Smith, what strikes us is that there is no question of power that comes into this kind of a conceptualization of labor and capital. When we think in terms of factors of production, it is as if they're all on par with each other. One is, of course, you're also bringing in living and non-living kind of things into the picture. But even if you were to take that aside, the real question is the question of power. Is it that landowners have more power than capitalists, or is it that capitalists have more power than the workers, right? And without the question of power, then there is a certain implication for politics, but also philosophically speaking, we have changed the way we think about and how the economy is structured. We have moved away from political economy, as it was called then, to economics. And in the process, we have also removed power to be a central feature of our economies, and we have made it an appendage to these questions. And this is, I mean, the way in which we think about factors of production is mainly owes to the work of Alfred Marshall in his Principles of Economics, and which, as the cover page shows, is also in one place where you find the supply and demand approach to economics, which Krishna Bharadwaj had earlier mentioned. The third point is one of symmetry. We've just seen the diagram on the cover page of Marshall's book. And now this idea of price and quantity determination, supply and demand, is so commonplace in economics that people think that anything in economics can be explained by this supply and demand. Right? Anything as in, so you use the same principle of supply and demand to understand what happens in the goods market, what happens in the labor market, in the financial market, in the land market. It can be used anywhere. But what I want to highlight here is the aspect of symmetry. Supply and demand are postulated as symmetrical forces that operate in the economy. If you take a look at Adam Smith, or for that matter, Ricardo, it is very clear that they do not have any such notion of symmetry in their work. And what is, I mean, actually it is characterized by asymmetry. And what you also notice is that there is no functional form. Right? You cannot draw such functional form as you're drawing it now. And the question that I want to leave you with is, are social truths characterized by symmetry? Now, this is an important question because now symmetry is something that is studied in mathematics too. And there is research, or there are engagements with how certain features or certain concepts or certain, well, natural beings in the world are characterized by a certain symmetry, which has a certain beauty to it, a certain aesthetic to it. Now, that is one thing. But can we really say that social truths, when we are talking about economic resources, they are characterized by symmetry? Or is it a particular way to not really address the question of power? Or it's also how the theory is constructed, right? It is constructed by keeping symmetry in the picture. And of course, if you bring in imperfections, and I'm talking about a condition of perfect competition, but you're able to bring in asymmetry if you want to talk about power. But the basic model is built on symmetry. Now, and I've also already mentioned marginalism before. The pioneers of marginalism, of course, it is not that marginalist ideas did not exist before Jevons, who's writing in the 1870s. You find marginalist ideas in the work of J.B. Say when he tries to talk about use value and exchange value. You find it in the work of Cournot. So it's not that Jevons is the first one to talk about marginalist economics, but it's really in the 1870s with the work of Jevons, Walras, and Menger that these ideas got consolidated. And what is marginalist economics? And this is also the other reason that I don't want to use the term neoclassical economics, because I think that marginalism is really what we are talking about here. It is the approach to economics which makes use of marginalist notions, items or concepts such as marginal cost, marginal revenue, marginal product. And here the question that I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about is, do we reason at the margin? Right? Now, one way to think about it is that if we have studied marginalist economics and we've gone through 5 or 10 years of studies in mainstream economics, it is likely that we might at the end of it be forced or be taught or be educated to reason at the margin. Right? And I do not think that in general people reason at the margin. The other question that I want you to think about is, should we reason at the margin? That is it desirable to reason at the margin? And I think that we need to acknowledge that we are all influenced by so many human motivations and reasonings. It's not just that, we have a consistent set of preferences and we function like that. We are emotional beings fundamentally, I think. And therefore, how much of reasoning at the margin really drives human beings is a big open question. Right? And the second question that I've put here, which is, should we reason at the margin? One of the reasons why marginalist microeconomics suggests that it is important to reason at the margin is to work your way backwards. Because if you are under conditions of perfect competition, you have an efficient outcome, which is supposed to be good for all, right? And nobody can be made worse off, a Pareto efficient outcome. So that, and therefore everyone is happy. So therefore, reasoning at the margin, and if you are able to function like that, it is supposed to lead us to a good society. But this is certainly open to so many criticisms, and I don't even think this is healthy in general to even reason at the margin alone. Very often we study utility in economics, but unfortunately, because we do not really engage with the history of microeconomics or the history of economic thought in general, we don't spend time talking about the philosophical and the political history of utilitarianism as well as the implications of that. Right? And some of the people who are well known within the history of economic thought for having a strong utilitarian standpoint is Jeremy Bentham, J.S. Mill, William Stanley Jevons. Right? And in particular, one can see it within microeconomics. Now, one might now this version is the cardinal utility one. Now we have moved to the ordinal utility principle where we talk about marginal rate of substitution. But essentially, there is utility underlying the preferences, even though we are just talking about the ordering of preferences. But even there, the equilibrium condition is understood to be, relatively speaking, if relative prices are given by relative marginal utilities or the marginal rate of substitution, right? But even the and even though we have utility as an important part of our economics training, we don't really engage with some of its philosophical or political basis. And if we, one of the ways in which I think of the marginalist theory of value is to think of it as a utility theory of value because of its utilitarian foundations and basis. Of course, with the indifference curve and with ordinal utility, there is some difference, but I still think that it plays an important role. Now, as compared to this, you have different theories of value in other traditions. For instance, in the classical and the Marxian tradition, you have various kinds of labor theories of value, whether it's a labor commanded or the labor embodied theory of value. And I think that in a way, theory of value is really fundamental to economics, whatever kind of economics we might do, or the theory of price, if you want to call it that, because everything else is sort of connected to it. Now, whether one does feminist economics or ecological economics or macroeconomics, there has to be some underlying implicit theory of value. And one of the questions which I'm leaving it is open is to think about what does it mean for us to study a theory of value which has a utilitarian basis. And in fact, here I just want to share that now Hicks, who's famous for ISLM as well as other contributions to capital theory, when he pushes economics, marginalist economics, away from cardinal utility to ordinal utility, one of the things that he writes is that if you're not a utilitarian, you need to have a different theory of value. And according to him, this theory of value is given by the indifference curve approach or by Pareto and other people who are pushing for a ordinal theory of value. But I still think that the connection still remains. Now, let me move on to the discussion of wages within marginalist economics. And I think that from of all the things that I've discussed until now, I certainly think the question of how wages are determined has important implications for policy making and for politics. And I would also say that it also has an impact on people who might just study a bachelor's in economics and then go on to work in a firm or become a capitalist and decide how wages have to be determined, whether within the firm or within the household or uh, in both these contexts, I think that a proper understanding, a critical understanding of wage is important. Again, the mainstream way of thinking about it is to think in terms of supply and demand, and where wage is understood to be equal to the marginal product of labor. Now, I also want to mention that somebody like Thomas Piketty, who has written about inequality, if you read his book carefully, and I mean the book, the first book, the famous book, carefully, it is very clear that he also believes in the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. So he believes in the theory, but then he has this data and he shows that there are these issues which it brings up. But honestly, if we had a better theory of wage, we would have arrived at an understanding of inequality much more easily. The other problematic aspect of marginalist microeconomics, besides the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, is this inverse functional relationship between wages and the quantity of labor. Right? Let me repeat that. Another, and I think that this is a big problematic postulate of marginalist microeconomics, which also has macro implications, which is that they postulate an inverse relationship between wages and the quantity of employment. Now, what this means is that, and I mean, a lot of this is coming from Pigou, who Keynes was actually criticizing. What this implies is that if workers ask for higher minimum wages, it is actually bad for the workers because it results in a reduction of equilibrium employment. Now, how problematic is this kind of a postulation, right? And as students of economics and as teachers of economics, I think that we also need to have a critical perspective on the kind of economics that we learn and teach and research, because very often, I think, unknowingly and implicitly, we are controlled by the kind of theories and ideas that we are taught. And I feel that these two very simple things. One is that wage equals marginal product of labor under conditions of perfect competition. And this inverse functional relationship between wages and quantity of labor are a certain kind of intellectual devices of control. Control in the sense that they limit our political imagination and choices. Now, let me move on to the production function. As all of you know, it's basically a function which maps inputs into outputs. Again, one might think that it's a very harmless kind of thing. Basically, it says that if you have a certain combination of capital, labor, and A representing technology, it produces a certain output. Right? And implicit in this and associated with this is also the marginal productivity theory of income distribution that I spoke about earlier. And this is, in particular, the contribution is by J.B. Clark. Here, one can ask the question of the way in which it is postulated is as if there is a linear relationship between inputs and outputs. But the question that has come up associated with what is called the Cambridge Capital controversy in the 1960s was that, one, how is capital defined? But another question that can be posed is that aren't outputs also inputs? In which case, you cannot really have this kind of a linear view of inputs and outputs, but you need to think in a more circular manner. Or another way you can think about it is the intersectoral input-output relationship. The other implication of the production function, which, by the way, as I think many of you would know, is also an important aspect of the growth model, the supply side growth models, which have been popularized and which have won Nobel Prizes, especially those by Solow, Romer, and Nordhaus. Right? So different kinds of changes have been made, but essentially the way in which they see this is that if there is a growth in the labor force, it leads to growth, and if there's a growth in technology, it leads to growth. But the role of technological progress needs to be understood within the particular historical context. And if you look at demand-led growth theory, which comes from a heterodox kind of approach, it's very clear that the impact of technological progress on society is not necessarily always good. And the answer is that it depends, right? It is contingent on the kind of the nature of the economy that we are talking about. And maybe because I've already spoken about the production function, and earlier I've also spoken about the functional relationship between wages and the quantity of labor, this is something that I would ask you to reflect on, which is the ontological position of functions in social sciences, right? In what way does it actually create knowledge? Is it restricting our understanding, or is it enabling our understanding, or is it imposing a certain view of the society onto our imagination and therefore onto our politics and policy making? And here, let me just give you a little bit more of context. It is one thing to say that, okay, when prices increase, the quantity demanded decreases. But going from there, which is a common sense notion, which might happen in some contexts, going from there to having a functional form, which is twice differentiable, is a different thing altogether. This is a very common assumption that is made, and I think that without imposing diminishing returns to a factor, it is very difficult to get some of the smooth properties that marginalist economics gets, right? Such as, and most importantly, this is the assumption that is being made in the production function um, approach, as well as in general, what underlies the supply curve of the basic supply and demand approach. Here, one way in which diminishing returns is taught, especially in classrooms or in the textbook, is to think in terms of the margin. It's not just about the margin, but it tells us to think what happens when there is an increase in the input that you are using. Or if you are a consumer, it asks us to think what happens if there's an increase in the output that you're consuming. So it warrants a certain kind of philosophical thinking, which is that of a counterfactual, or the idea of a potential change. And the question, or counterfactuals are also called what if questions. So you ask a counterfactual question, and then you derive the answer, and then you differentiate, or then you do your rest of the calculations to arrive at your final answer. But even posing this kind of a counterfactual question changes the nature of how we do economics. And for instance, if you were to take, it's not that asking counterfactual question is problematic, but I think asking counterfactual question at the margin makes it seem that we are talking about imaginary societies, and we are not really talking about societies where there is no such change. And now, as you know, in behavioral economics, a lot of studies now show that people we are satisfied. We don't need to eat 10 ice creams. So there's no point in thinking of what happens to your marginal utility when you go on consuming more and more additions of the same unit. And similarly for production as well, right? So this idea of potential change is something to again keep in mind, and I think it's a peculiar way of reasoning. Uh, Now, in the case of land, to talk about diminishing returns makes sense. And in fact, if you read Ricardo's work, he also talks about the idea of marginal land. Right? Because when you're using the same input and you have land fertility or natural resources, the more you use, you know that the fertility declines. But to use the same kind of formulation for labor and capital, I think that it does not really flow. And this kind of an extension of the marginal principle from land to labor and capital, which Krishna Bhardwaj has excellently written about, is, according to her, an illegitimate kind of extension. It makes sense in the case of land, but not really in the case of labor and capital. So one question that might come up in your mind is that how is marginalist economics still able to get diminishing returns? One of the ways it's able to do that is to say that if a factor is given, so one way to interpret the given is to bring in the short run. Another way to think about a given factor is to think in terms of full employment of all factors of production. So you need to bring in these elements, only then can you sort of derive these diminishing returns. The question of efficiency is very frequently spoken about in economics, right? And it is as if the idea of Pareto efficiency is desirable in and of itself. And what we try to do then is that within pure theory, it is desirable, and then we try to extend it to practical policy considerations. And this is really the power of ideas, right? And if you actually look at the history of and people who have written about efficiency, I would really strongly recommend that you read these two papers, right? One is a paper by Daniel Bromley, which is titled "The Ideology of Efficiency," right? And how it's really an ideology and how it has been used in policy analysis. And if you read Irene Bertonet's work, which is a history of economic thought article, is about history of marginalist economics itself. You clearly see that the way in which efficiency and Pareto efficiency is so central to microeconomics today sort of breaks down. And it has very problematic implications for policy as well. And the question to ask is, very often it is said that it's desirable, but is it really desirable for the workers? Who is it desirable for? I think that this maybe I can go over a little bit quickly, but the idea of perfect competition is the base on which microeconomics or marginalist microeconomics is built up. But it is clearly a static notion. It is not dynamic because firms are price takers. It's really a very artificial construct, and I would say that it's very anti-competitive. Now, this does not mean that there are no alternative notions of competition. This does not mean that competition, given certain rules and regulations, is not good. Right? So if you take a look at the idea of free competition, which is there in political economy, you notice that it has a much more dynamic understanding of competition, and it's not artificial or sort of restrictive in the way marginalist notion of perfect competition is. And also remember that the idea of perfect competition and the idea of efficiency, they're also interconnected, and you have the fundamental welfare theorems, as they are called. And you might ask the question now, what is the reason for adopting such a static and artificial notion of perfect competition? Right? Is it for mathematical reasons? Is it to ensure that is there an ideology there which says that markets of this kind are actually good, but then they're not competitive at all? Or is it to show that markets tend to be efficient if they're perfectly competitive? Now, what could be the reason? Is it a mathematical reason where we actually arrive at equilibrium? So all these are questions one can pose. This brings me also to the question of public goods. And I think that in general, it's not just mainstream economists, but also heterodox economists talk about public goods in a very favorable manner. And here I just want to provide a certain critical perspective on the idea of public good itself. Right? The way in which public goods is understood within microeconomics is within the context of externalities, right? Which suggests that if prices are unable to incorporate the effects of a particular production, or if there are positive externalities or negative externalities, then the government has to step in, or then they're called public goods of various kinds. But what is the politics of public goods? It is very, very clear within marginalist microeconomics that the primary responsibility is with the market. Now, if the market fails, the government should step in. Right? So, yes, at the end of the day, when you think of public goods, it is as if you're saying that education should be provided for all. But if you're using the argument of public good, what we are effectively saying is that because the market is not able to provide education because of externalities and it fails, that is why the government should step in. And I think that if one reads Adam Smith, there was a clear understanding that there are some goods and services which are necessaries. Right there, it's not a question of a market providing it or another mechanism providing it. It is a necessary, so therefore it has to be